My hands were shaking before I even understood why. I was standing on the bridge of the Harbinger's wake, staring at a wall of scrolling data that should not have existed. A transmission had slipped through a gap in a Dominion relay station, a gap that should have been sealed, a gap that some tired alien technician had forgotten to patch. And because of that one mistake, I was reading words that were never meant for human eyes. The message was short, it was cold, it named a colony, it named a date, it named a time. Dawn, 3 days from now, on Kest 9. I read it 3 times before I let myself believe it. Kest 9 was not a military post. It was a small mining colony on the edge of human space, home to a few thousand people who spent their days pulling minerals out of red rock and sending their children to a one-room schoolhouse built from a converted cargo container. It had no defenses to speak of. It had a handful of drones for asteroid tracking and a single old patrol ship that mostly existed to reassure people rather than to fight. The transmission called it a pacification target. That word sat in my stomach like a stone. I had heard enough alien diplomatic language by then to know that pacification did not mean negotiation. It meant erasure, dressed up in a term soft enough that whoever read it in a boardroom somewhere would not have to picture what it actually looked like on the ground. I called my captain to the bridge before I had even finished processing what I was looking at. Captain Idris Bello arrived within 2 minutes, still fastening the collar of his uniform, his eyes already sharp with the particular alertness of a man who had learned not to waste time asking why he'd been woken. I showed him the message. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked at me and asked only one question. "Are you certain this is real?" I told him I was as certain as I could be without more time to verify it. The relay signature matched known Dominion military frequencies. The encryption was old, a variant we had cracked months earlier during a routine intercept, one they apparently hadn't realized we'd broken. Everything about it looked genuine. Everything about it terrified me. Bello did not waste a moment doubting me further. He gave the order to hold our position and begin quiet verification. No broad alerts, no wide broadcasts, nothing that might tip off whoever was listening. We had learned, over the short years since first contact, that the galaxy was full of ears we could not see. For the next several hours, I barely left the bridge. I cross-referenced fleet positions, traffic patterns, resource shipments moving through nearby systems. Everything lined up. A cluster of unregistered Dominion vessels had been quietly repositioning for the past 2 weeks, moving in small, deniable groups, the kind of movement that would look like nothing unless you already suspected something was wrong. They were not hiding from everyone. They were hiding from people who didn't already know to look. I thought about the families on Kest 9. I had never been there myself, but I had read the colony logs during a routine sweep months earlier. I remembered a photograph attached to a supply request, a group of children standing outside the schoolhouse, squinting against the light of a sun that was not quite Earth's sun, but close enough to feel like home. I remembered thinking, at the time, how strange and wonderful it was that humanity had come this far, spreading out into the dark with nothing but stubbornness and hope. Now that same stubborn hope was sitting directly in the path of a fleet that intended to erase it before dawn on a day that was already counting down. I brought the full picture to Bello as soon as I had it. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the table between us, his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as though he were already running the numbers of what needed to happen next. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. He said that the galaxy had spent decades deciding what humanity was allowed to be: small, new, harmless. He said that assumption was about to become the most dangerous mistake anyone in that fleet had ever made. "We are not going to wait for permission," he told me. "We are going to be ready." I asked him what he meant by ready, because at that point, I still believed readiness meant calling for reinforcements, alerting command, following the long chain of approvals that governed everything humanity did on the galactic stage. He shook his head slowly, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his expression that was not caution, it was resolve. "We do not have time to convince people who do not want to be convinced," he said. "We prepare ourselves, and we prepare that colony, and we do it quietly, and we do it fast. I did not argue. I had read the message. I had seen the fleet positions. I understood, in that moment, that the version of humanity the wider galaxy believed in, the quiet junior species, still finding its feet among the stars, was not going to be the version that showed up at Kest 9 in 3 days. We set course immediately, running dark, our transponders adjusted to blend into normal shipping lanes. I spent that first night compiling everything I knew about Dominion tactics, pulling from years of careful observation, diplomatic exchanges, and the occasional skirmish report that never made it into public record. I wanted to understand not just what they might do, but how they thought. What I found unsettled me almost as much as the original transmission had. The Dominion, and the wider coalition of species they represented, fought wars the way other cultures played formal sports. There were rules, there were rituals, combat was almost always announced in advance, positions were declared, and engagements were fought with a kind of theatrical restraint, designed to minimize actual loss of life on both sides, while still allowing the stronger side to claim dominance. It was, in its own strange way, a civilized system, built by species who had been fighting each other for thousands of years, and had long ago decided that total annihilation served no one. They had never fought humanity. Not really. A handful of tense standoffs, a few diplomatic incidents, nothing that could be called a genuine conflict. And because of that, they were about to walk into Kest 9, expecting the same kind of controlled, ritualized resistance they had always faced from every other species they had ever pacified. They had no idea what they were about to find instead. I brought my notes to Bello the next morning, and together we began building something the Dominion fleet could never have anticipated, not because it was more advanced than their technology, but because it followed none of the rules they assumed applied to every fight in known space. Humanity's history was not gentle, it was not ritualized, it was full of moments where entire nations had been forced to defend everything they had with whatever tools were available, moments where soldiers had improvised, adapted, and refused to follow any script the enemy expected. That history, buried for decades under the polished language of diplomacy and cooperation, was still there, waiting. Bello called it our oldest advantage. I called it the thing nobody else in the galaxy had bothered to study, because nobody else believed it mattered anymore. By the second day, I had stopped thinking about Kest 9 as a distant colony I had only seen in photographs. I thought about it as a place I would be standing on very soon, under a sky that was not my own, trying to make sure a group of miners and their children survived a dawn that was already written down somewhere as their ending. We were not going to let it be their ending. I remember standing at the viewport late that second night, watching the stars slide past as we adjusted course toward the outer colonies, and feeling something settle in my chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger. It was closer to purpose. I had joined the fleet because I believed humanity deserved a place among the stars that was earned through skill and preparation rather than luck. Now that belief was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Bello found me there, arms crossed, his reflection faint in the glass beside mine. He asked if I was ready for what was coming. I told him I honestly did not know. He said that was the correct answer, because anyone who claimed certainty before a fight like this one had not thought hard enough about what was actually at stake. Then he told me something I had not expected. He said that in 3 days, an alien fleet would arrive at Kest 9, fully convinced they were the ones holding every advantage, superior numbers, superior technology, centuries of experience against species who had never once refused to follow the old rules of engagement. He said their confidence was going to be the first thing we took from them. I asked how. He looked at me, and for the first time since the message had arrived, I saw something close to a smile. By making sure, he said, that when they arrived expecting a quiet, predictable target, they found something they had never trained for. Something no simulation in their long history had ever prepared them to face. I did not fully understand what he meant, not yet. But over the following hours, as we began drafting the outline of a plan that broke almost every convention the wider galaxy considered standard, I started to see the shape of it. We were not going to fight the battle they expected, we were going to build one they had never imagined, using terrain, timing, and the one thing every alien intelligence report about humanity had always underestimated, our willingness to do whatever it took to protect our own. 3 days. That was all the time we had before the fleet meant to erase Kest 9 arrived at its gates. 3 days to turn a handful of miners, a battered warship, and a single furious tactical officer into something the Dominion had never encountered before. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the ship carrying us forward, and made myself a promise. Whatever happened at dawn on Kest 9, the galaxy was about to learn exactly why every species that had ever underestimated humanity eventually regretted it. The countdown had already begun. There was no time left to be afraid. There was only time to prepare. And so, with the weight of that message still burning in my mind, I turned away from the viewport, walked back to the bridge, and began the work that would decide whether an entire colony lived to see another sunrise. We reached the edge of Concord space by the following morning, and that was when the real difficulty began, because preparing for a fight was one thing, but convincing anyone in a position of authority that the fight was actually coming turned out to be an entirely different battle altogether. Bello requested an emergency channel with the Terran Defense Council the moment we were in range, and I sat beside him as the connection opened, watching a row of tired, skeptical faces appear across the display. I laid out everything: the intercepted transmission, the verified fleet movements, the timeline counting down toward dawn on Kest 9. I expected concern, I expected urgency. What I got instead was silence, followed by careful, diplomatic doubt. One counselor suggested the message might be a fabrication designed to provoke an unnecessary military response. Another argued that the Dominion had no history of unprovoked aggression against a colony as insignificant as Kest 9, and that acting on unverified intelligence could damage the fragile relationships humanity had spent years building with the wider Concord. I wanted to shout that a fragile relationship meant nothing to the miners who would not survive to see it grow stronger, but I held my tongue, because Bello was already speaking, calm and measured, laying out the evidence piece by piece. It did not matter. By the end of the call, the Council's official position was clear. Without independent Concord verification, no formal fleet response would be authorized. They would look into it, they said. They would monitor the situation. Words that meant nothing to people who had only 3 days left before the sky above their home turned into judgment. I remember looking at Bello after the channel closed, waiting for him to tell me what came next, half expecting him to say we had no choice but to keep pushing through official channels. Instead, he simply stood, straightened his uniform, and told me to prepare the crew for departure. "We are not waiting for permission that will never come in time," he said. "We are going to Kest 9 ourselves, and we are going to make sure that colony survives, whether the Council believes us or not." I felt something tighten in my chest, a mixture of fear and fierce, unshakable pride. This was not the reckless bravado of soldiers eager for a fight. This was a quiet, deliberate decision made by people who understood exactly what they were risking, and chose to risk it anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. Word spread through the ship quickly. Not everyone agreed with the decision. A handful of crew members raised concerns about acting without authorization, about the political consequences if we were wrong, about what would happen to all of us if this went badly. Bello addressed those concerns directly, gathering the crew in the main hold and speaking plainly. He told them the truth, that there were no guarantees, that acting alone carried real risk, both to our careers and to our lives. But he also told them what waiting would cost, and he let every person in that room decide for themselves whether they were willing to stand behind the mission. Not a single person walked away. I think that moment taught me more about humanity than anything I had read in a history file. It was not blind obedience that held us together. It was choice, made freely, by people who understood exactly what they were choosing. So over the following hours, I threw myself into preparation with an intensity that left little room for sleep. I studied everything I could find about Dominion combat doctrine, cross-referencing old diplomatic reports, engagement records from other species, anything that might reveal a pattern we could use. what I found confirmed what Bello had said days earlier. Their entire approach to warfare relied on predictability, formal declarations, measured advances, a structured escalation of force designed to secure surrender with minimal loss on both sides. They had never needed anything else, because no species they had encountered had ever refused to follow the pattern. We were going to refuse. I began drafting a defense plan built entirely around that refusal, sketching rough concepts late into the night and revising them each time a new detail from our intelligence gathering forced a change. Bello reviewed every version with careful, patient attention, asking hard questions, pushing me to think beyond the obvious, reminding me constantly that we would only get one chance to make this work. We also began preparing something the Council would never have approved, even if they believed us. Unconventional defenses, improvised weapons built from mining equipment and salvage, terrain modifications that used the colony's own geography against an enemy who would arrive expecting an open, undefended target. None of it followed the neat, careful rules of engagement the wider galaxy considered proper. All of it was built from the same stubborn, resourceful tradition that had carried humanity through every crisis in its long, difficult history. I found myself thinking often about the people of Kest 9 during those hours, wondering how they would react when a warship they had never requested arrived at their doorstep with a warning most of them would have no reason to believe. I worried they might panic. I worried they might refuse to cooperate, unwilling to accept that a quiet mining colony could possibly be the target of an entire alien fleet. I did not yet understand how wrong that worry was, or how quickly the people of Kest 9 would prove themselves capable of far more than anyone, including me, had expected. As we approached the final stretch of our journey, Bello called me to his quarters privately, something he rarely did. He wanted to go over the plan one final time, just the two of us, before we arrived and the real work began. He asked me a question that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He asked whether I believed we could actually win. I told him the truth. I did not know. The numbers were against us. The technology gap was real. Everything about this fight, on paper, favored the fleet bearing down on that small, unsuspecting colony. He nodded slowly, then told me something I would never forget. He said that every battle humanity had ever won against impossible odds had looked exactly like this beforehand, uncertain, dangerous, and far from guaranteed. He said the only thing that ever tipped those battles in our favor was refusing to accept the odds as final and using every ounce of creativity, resolve, and stubborn will to change them. We are not going to win because we are stronger, he said. We are going to win because they have no idea what strength like ours actually looks like. I left that conversation with a clearer sense of purpose than I had felt since the moment I first read that intercepted message. Whatever waited for us at Kest 9, we were not walking into it blind, and we were not walking into it alone. The ship's chronometer ticked steadily toward our final approach. Somewhere ahead of us, an unsuspecting colony was living out its last ordinary day, unaware of the fleet already moving quietly toward its coordinates, unaware of the small, determined group of humans racing to make sure that dawn did not become the ending anyone had planned. I closed my notes, checked the timeline one final time, and allowed myself a single steadying breath. 2 days remained. 2 days to turn warning into readiness, and readiness into the kind of resistance no alien fleet in that region of space had ever encountered before. I intended to make every hour of it count. We dropped out of transit above Kest 9 in the grey hush before local sunrise, and the first thing I saw through the viewport was how small everything looked. A scattering of domes clustered along a shallow valley, a handful of landing pads, a network of narrow roads connecting mining shafts to storage silos. From orbit, it looked like a place that had never once considered the possibility of an attack, because it never needed to. Bello ordered our descent immediately, keeping our approach low and quiet, avoiding anything that might register on distant sensors. We landed on the outskirts of the colony, away from the main dome, and within minutes, a small group of local officials arrived to meet us, confused and wary, at the sight of an unscheduled warship on their doorstep. The colony administrator was a woman named Priya Doyle, sharp-eyed and steady despite the early hour and the obvious alarm on her face. She listened as Bello explained why we had come, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something harder and more focused as the weight of the situation settled over her. She did not waste time arguing about whether the threat was real. She asked instead what needed to be done and how quickly her people could do it. I felt something ease in my chest at that response. I had worried the colonists might resist, might refuse to believe that their quiet lives were about to be interrupted by a fleet built to erase them. Instead, Priya gathered her senior staff within the hour, and together we began laying out a plan that would use every advantage the colony's own geography could offer. The valley itself became our first tool. Kest 9 sat inside a natural basin, ringed by low ridges of mineral-rich rock that had been mined for years, leaving behind a maze of tunnels and access shafts most outsiders would never suspect existed. I spent the following hours walking those tunnels with a mining engineer named Callum Ashby, mapping every entrance, every collapse point, every place where old equipment could be repurposed into something far more useful than its original design intended. Callum had spent 15 years working that rock, and he knew it better than any survey map could show. He pointed out weak points in the tunnel ceilings that could be triggered to collapse sections on command, sealing pathways an enemy might try to use for cover. He showed me storage caches full of old mining charges, technically decommissioned, but still functional with the right adjustments, more than enough to reshape the terrain exactly when we needed it to shift. While Callum and I worked underground, Bello coordinated efforts above ground with a small technical team led by a young systems specialist named Priya Doyle had assigned, a quiet, methodical woman named Naomi Ferris. Naomi had spent years managing the colony's environmental systems, and she understood the dome infrastructure well enough to see possibilities no outsider would have noticed. She began rerouting power conduits, converting sections of the colony's heat regulation system into overload triggers that could blind incoming sensors with a sudden burst of thermal interference at exactly the right moment. None of it looked like a battlefield. That was the entire point. From orbit, from any standard scan, Kest 9 would look exactly as it always had, quiet, undefended, unaware. Every genuine defense was hidden beneath the surface, woven into systems the colonists used every day for entirely ordinary purposes. I spent that first full day moving between the underground tunnels and the colony's central command room, refining timing sequences, checking redundancies, making sure every piece of the plan could function, even if another piece failed. Bello reviewed each update with careful attention, occasionally pushing back on details that seemed too risky, always focused on protecting as many lives as possible rather than simply winning the fight. By the second day, word of the coming danger had spread through the entire colony, and I braced myself for panic, but what I found instead surprised me deeply. Families did not scatter in fear, they organized. Parents who had never held a weapon in their lives volunteered for support roles, learning basic communication protocols, first response procedures, evacuation routes for the youngest children who would be moved to the deepest, safest tunnels before dawn arrived. I met a man named Julian Pratt, a former shuttle mechanic who had spent years fixing engines rather than fighting battles, and yet he approached me directly, asking how he could help. When I explained the decoy heat signature plan Naomi was building, he immediately identified 3 additional pieces of salvage equipment that could strengthen the deception, old scanner arrays nobody had used in years, repurposed to broadcast false readings the moment the Dominion fleet arrived. That was the pattern I saw again and again over those 2 days. Ordinary people, none of them soldiers, none of them trained for anything like this, finding ways to contribute using skills built from years of simply surviving and working on a harsh, unforgiving world. Their stubborn resourcefulness reminded me powerfully of everything Bello had said back on the ship, that humanity's oldest strength had never disappeared, only waited quietly for a moment like this one. On the evening before the fleet was scheduled to arrive, Priya called a gathering in the colony's largest dome, the same space normally used for community meetings and seasonal celebrations. Nearly every adult in the colony attended, along with a handful of older children old enough to understand what was happening. Bello stood before them and spoke plainly, laying out exactly what tomorrow would bring, refusing to soften the danger or offer false comfort. He told them the fleet arriving at dawn believed this colony would fall without resistance. He told them that belief was the single greatest advantage available to us, because an enemy who expects no resistance prepares for none. He asked every person in that room to trust the plan, to follow instructions precisely when the moment came, and to remember that survival depended not on individual bravery alone, but on every piece of the defense working together exactly as designed. I watched the faces in that crowd as he spoke, and I saw fear, but I did not see despair. I saw the same quiet, determined resolve I had witnessed in Priya's response on our first morning, the same resourcefulness I had seen in Julian's quick thinking, the same steady competence I had come to rely on in Callum and Naomi over the past 2 days. After the gathering ended, I found myself standing near the edge of the dome with Priya, both of us looking out over the darkening valley where, in a matter of hours, everything would change forever. She asked me quietly whether I believed the plan would work. I told her the truth, the same truth I had given Bello days earlier. I did not know for certain. No plan built from improvisation and desperation ever came with guarantees. But I told her something else too, something I had come to believe deeply over the past 2 days of watching her community respond to impossible circumstances with steady, practical resolve. I told her that whatever happened at dawn, the fleet approaching Kest 9 was not prepared for the kind of resistance they were about to encounter. Not because we had better weapons or greater numbers, but because every person in that colony had spent the last 2 days transforming fear into preparation, and that transformation was something no alien intelligence report could have predicted or accounted for. She nodded slowly, then asked me one final question before we parted for the night. She asked what would happen to her colony's reputation among the wider galaxy once this was over, whether Kest 9 would be remembered as the place where humanity finally showed its true nature to species who had spent years underestimating it. I did not have an answer for her then. I only knew that whatever reputation followed, it would be earned honestly, built from the choices this small community was about to make together. I spent the final hours before dawn moving through the tunnels one last time with Callum, double-checking every trigger point, every collapse sequence, every piece of equipment that needed to function perfectly when the moment arrived. Naomi ran final diagnostics on the sensor deception systems, her hands steady, despite the exhaustion visible on her face after 2 days without proper rest. Bello coordinated final positioning for our ship, and the handful of support vessels we had managed to bring quietly into the system, all of them hidden, all of them waiting. As the first hints of gray light began touching the eastern ridge of the valley, I stood at the edge of the primary dome, watching the sky where, according to the intelligence that had brought us here, an entire fleet was about to appear expecting an easy, quiet conquest. I thought about the photograph I had seen days earlier, the children standing outside the schoolhouse, squinting against unfamiliar sunlight. I thought about Priya's steady resolve, Callum's quiet expertise, Naomi's careful precision, Julian's quick resourcefulness. I thought about every ordinary person in that valley who had spent 2 days becoming something far more formidable than anyone watching from a distant Dominion command ship could possibly imagine. The sky began to lighten further, and somewhere beyond the range of our sensors, I knew the fleet was already moving into position, confident, unhurried, utterly unaware of what was waiting for them below. Dawn was coming. We were ready. The first Dominion ship appeared exactly on schedule, sliding out of transit space with the calm, unhurried precision of a fleet that had never once doubted the outcome of what it was about to do. I watched the sensor feed from the command room beneath the colony, my pulse steady despite the tightness in my chest, counting each new arrival as it took position above Kest 9. 6 vessels, larger than anything the colony itself could have fielded, arranged in a loose formation that spoke of confidence rather than caution. They were not preparing for resistance, they were preparing for a formality, a ritual advance toward a target they believed had no way to fight back. Bello stood beside me, his voice low and even as he relayed final instructions to every team spread across the valley. Naomi's hand hovered over the control panel that would trigger the sensor deception the moment the fleet began its scanning sweep. Callum waited below ground, ready to collapse the first tunnel section the instant enemy forces attempted to establish a landing zone in the wrong location. Julian and a dozen other volunteers held position near the decoy heat arrays, ready to activate false signatures the second real ones needed to disappear. Every person in that valley understood exactly what came next, because we had spent 2 days making certain of it. The lead Dominion vessel opened a wide broadcast channel, the same kind of formal declaration Bello had told me to expect, a calm, almost courteous demand for surrender, addressed to a colony that, according to every piece of intelligence they possessed, had no meaningful way to resist. The voice on the other end sounded almost bored, reciting terms it clearly expected no one to challenge. Naomi triggered the sensor deception the moment the broadcast ended, flooding Dominion scanners with a wash of false thermal signatures scattered across empty stretches of the valley floor, drawing their attention toward locations that held nothing but old equipment and carefully placed heat emitters. From their perspective, panic and disorganized movement would appear to be unfolding exactly where we wanted them to look, while the true defenses remained hidden beneath layers of rock and quiet, careful preparation. Their formation shifted in response, several smaller landing craft breaking away from the main fleet, descending toward the false signatures with the same unhurried confidence that had defined every moment of their approach so far. I felt a fierce, focused satisfaction watching that shift unfold exactly as we had planned it. The first landing craft touched down nearly a full kilometer from the actual colony center, directly above one of Callum's prepared collapse points. I gave the signal the instant confirmation came through, and Callum triggered the sequence without hesitation. The ground beneath that landing craft gave way in a controlled collapse, swallowing the surrounding terrain and stranding the vessel at an awkward, unstable angle that made rapid deployment impossible. Confusion rippled through the Dominion formation immediately. I watched their communication patterns shift on our intercepted channels, calm procedural language giving way to sharper, more urgent exchanges, as commanders who had never encountered unexpected resistance struggled to understand what had just happened to a landing zone that should have been perfectly safe. Bello used that confusion without wasting a single second. Our own ship and the small group of support vessels we had kept hidden decloaked in coordinated bursts, emerging from concealment at multiple points around the valley, rather than a single obvious location. To Dominion sensors, it must have looked as though resistance had appeared from nowhere, scattered and impossible to predict, exactly the opposite of the organized, ritualized battle lines their doctrine had trained them to expect. I heard their commander's voice shift again over the intercepted channel, confusion sharpening into something closer to alarm as more of their formation began registering unexpected activity across a landscape that should have offered no resistance whatsoever. Naomi activated a second wave of decoy signatures, drawing another group of landing craft toward a different section of prepared terrain, while Julian's team shifted the real heat emitters to mask our support vessels' true positions as they moved into intercept range. Every piece of the plan we had built over the past 2 days was unfolding in careful, coordinated sequence, each element supporting the next exactly as intended. The Dominion fleet's response revealed exactly what Bello had predicted back on the ship days earlier. Their tactics assumed measured escalation, careful positioning, formal advances that allowed both sides time to assess and respond according to established protocol. They were not built for chaos. They were not built for an opponent who refused every expectation of how this battle was supposed to unfold. I watched one of their larger vessels attempt to reposition toward what its sensors identified as our primary command location, only to find itself caught between 2 additional collapse points Callum triggered in quick succession, forcing an emergency course correction that scattered its formation even further. Their coordinated confidence, so clear in the opening moments of their arrival, was already beginning to fracture under the weight of a battlefield behaving nothing like the countless other engagements their long history had prepared them for. Bello's voice remained steady throughout, directing our support vessels with calm, precise instructions, each command building on the confusion already spreading through the Dominion formation. I found myself moving between sensor stations and communication relays with a focus so complete that time seemed to compress into a single continuous sequence of decisions, each one flowing directly into the next. A third landing craft attempted a more cautious approach, clearly adjusting for the unexpected resistance already encountered, moving slower, scanning more carefully before committing to a landing zone. I recognized the shift immediately and relayed a warning to Callum, who adjusted his timing accordingly, waiting until the craft had fully committed before triggering a final collapse sequence that sealed off its intended retreat path entirely. The battlefield above Kest 9 had transformed within minutes from a confident, orderly advance into something closer to controlled disorder. Every Dominion attempt to re-establish structure met immediately by another unexpected complication drawn directly from the terrain itself. Their formal doctrine, built across centuries of predictable engagements, had no answer for an enemy who had turned an entire valley into a weapon while appearing to offer no resistance at all. I allowed myself a brief moment to look toward the horizon, where the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge, casting warm light across a valley now filled with the quiet, controlled chaos we had spent 2 days preparing. Dawn had arrived exactly as the intercepted transmission promised, but the fleet, expecting an easy, quiet victory, had instead found something far more complicated waiting for them, and their confidence, so absolute only minutes earlier, was already beginning to unravel in ways their long history of careful, ritualized warfare had never prepared them to face. The real fight was only beginning. The stranded landing craft near the first collapse point became the site of our next challenge, and I made the decision to lead the response team myself rather than direct it remotely, because I needed to understand firsthand exactly how Dominion soldiers operated under pressure they had never faced before. I moved through the uneven terrain with a small group that included 2 of our ship's security officers, a steady, quick-thinking woman named Bridget Calloway, and a calm, methodical man named Owen Marsh, along with Julian, who had insisted on joining, despite having no formal combat training, arguing correctly that his knowledge of the surrounding equipment made him more useful on the ground than anywhere else. The Dominion soldiers who emerged from the stranded craft moved with a rigid, formal discipline that immediately told me everything I needed to know about their training. Every step, every positioning adjustment followed a pattern clearly drawn from centuries of standardized doctrine, the kind of predictable structure built for opponents who followed the same rules they did. We did not follow those rules. Bridget moved first, using the uneven, collapsed terrain to approach from an angle their formation had not accounted for, closing the distance before their sensors could properly track her position. Owen followed a heartbeat later, using a completely different route, splitting their attention in 2 directions at once. I watched their formal defensive structure struggle to adjust, designed as it was for opponents who advanced predictably from expected angles rather than scattering unpredictably across broken ground. Within minutes, the small group of Dominion soldiers at that landing site found themselves disoriented, their formal training offering little guidance for an engagement that refused to follow any pattern they recognized. We secured the site without significant escalation, using restraint and precise positioning rather than overwhelming force, exactly as Bello had instructed every team before dawn. One soldier, separated from the rest during the confusion, found himself cut off with no clear path back to his unit. I approached carefully, weapon lowered, signaling as clearly as I could that immediate surrender would end the encounter without further complication. He hesitated only a moment before complying, clearly unnerved by an approach that offered him an option his own doctrine rarely extended to opponents it considered beneath serious consideration. We brought him back to the colony's secure holding area, and I found myself assigned to the initial questioning, given my familiarity with the intercepted intelligence that had brought us here in the first place. He sat across from me, still clearly shaken, his formal composure cracking under circumstances his training had never prepared him to navigate. He asked me, through the translation unit, why we had not followed the expected patterns of engagement, why we had allowed confusion and disorder, rather than a clean, structured confrontation his side could have properly assessed and responded to, according to established protocol. I considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said would likely be repeated to whoever eventually reviewed this encounter within Dominion Command. I told him that humanity had never had the luxury of fighting wars according to rules designed by species who assumed every conflict could be managed through careful ritual and measured escalation. I told him that our history was built from moments where survival depended entirely on adaptability, on refusing to accept that any single approach to a threat was the only approach available. He asked what that meant for species like his own, accustomed to a galaxy where conflict followed patterns everyone understood and respected. I told him it meant the galaxy was about to learn that humanity did not measure strength by how closely it followed anyone else's expectations. I told him our only true rule was protecting what mattered, using whatever combination of preparation, adaptability, and quiet stubborn resolve that protection required. He fell silent after that, and I left the questioning to continue coordinating the wider defense, aware that the battle above and around Kest 9 was far from finished, despite the small success we had achieved at this single landing site. Reports continued arriving throughout the following hour, each one confirming the same pattern unfolding across the valley. Dominion forces attempting to re-establish their formal advance, only to find themselves repeatedly disrupted by terrain modifications, unexpected positioning, and coordinated resistance that refused to follow any recognizable structure. Naomi's sensor deceptions continued drawing portions of their fleet toward false targets, buying critical time for Callum's team to prepare additional collapse points along routes the Dominion forces seemed likely to attempt next. Bellow's voice came through my communicator as I made my way back toward the central command area, informing me that our support vessels had successfully disabled 2 additional landing craft using coordinated maneuvers that exploited gaps in the Dominion formation's structured defensive patterns. Their fleet, so confident and organized only an hour earlier, was now struggling to maintain any coherent strategy against an opponent who continued reshaping the battlefield faster than their doctrine could adjust to respond. I paused briefly near the edge of the valley, watching smoke rise from one of the disabled landing craft in the distance, and allowed myself a moment to process everything unfolding around me. This was not the clean, decisive victory I might have imagined back when I first read that intercepted transmission. It was messy, uncertain, built from countless small decisions made under enormous pressure by people who had never expected to find themselves in this position. But it was working. Every element of the plan we had built over the past 2 days was functioning exactly as intended, each piece supporting the next, transforming a quiet mining colony into something far more formidable than any Dominion intelligence report could have predicted. I received word shortly after that Priya wanted an update on the colonists sheltering in the deepest tunnels, and I made my way there directly, needing to see for myself how the community was holding up under the weight of everything happening above them. I found them calm, focused. Children kept occupied with quiet activities while adults monitored communication updates and prepared medical supplies for anyone who might need them. Priya moved among them with steady, reassuring confidence, checking on each family personally, offering updates without exaggeration or false comfort. She asked me directly how the defense was progressing, and I told her honestly that we were holding, that the fleet's confidence had already begun fracturing under the weight of resistance they had never trained to face, but that the fight was far from over. She nodded, then asked a question that stayed with me for the rest of that long, exhausting day. She asked whether I believed the Dominion commander leading this fleet understood yet what kind of mistake they had made in choosing Kest 9 as a target. I told her I believed that understanding was only just beginning to take shape, and that the next few hours would determine exactly how completely that realization set in. I left the tunnels and made my way back toward the surface, where the battle above the valley continued unfolding in ways the Dominion fleet had clearly never anticipated, their formal doctrine crumbling piece by piece against an opponent who had spent 2 days transforming quiet preparation into something the wider galaxy was about to remember for a very long time. By mid-morning, the Dominion fleet's formation had fractured into something barely recognizable as a coordinated force. I stood beside Bello in the command room, watching sensor readouts that told a story no one aboard those ships could have predicted 3 days earlier, when their commander had ordered this fleet toward Kest 9, fully expecting an effortless, uncontested advance. Their remaining landing craft had pulled back to a cautious holding pattern above the valley, no longer attempting fresh deployments after losing contact with nearly half their initial force. Communication intercepts revealed growing tension among their command staff. Voices that had begun the day calm and procedural now sharpened with confusion and, unmistakably, something close to genuine concern. Bello turned to me at that moment and said something I had been waiting to hear since this entire mission began. He said their commander was about to make the most important decision of this engagement, and everything we had built over the past 2 days depended on what happened next. I understood immediately what he meant. A Dominion commander operating within their traditional doctrine would eventually recognize this engagement had moved far outside acceptable parameters, and formal protocol demanded a strategic reassessment rather than continued escalation against an opponent whose behavior refused every established pattern. The question was whether pride, or perhaps desperation, would override that protocol. I did not have long to wait for an answer. Sensor data showed their main command vessel beginning to reposition, pulling back from its central holding position toward a more defensive posture at the edge of the system. Smaller support craft began regrouping around it, a formation that unmistakably signaled retreat rather than renewed aggression. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had been carrying since the moment I first read that intercepted transmission days earlier. But Bello's expression remained cautious, and he reminded me quietly that retreat was not yet guaranteed, that commanders backed into difficult positions sometimes made desperate final decisions before accepting defeat. He was right to remain cautious. Within minutes, the Dominion command vessel altered course again, and for a brief, tense moment, I feared they intended a final concentrated strike against the colony itself, a last attempt to salvage something from an engagement that had gone catastrophically wrong for them. I relayed an urgent warning to every team across the valley, watching Callum's tunnel network prepare final contingency collapses, watching Naomi ready one last wave of sensor deception, watching our remaining support vessels reposition to intercept any renewed advance toward the colony's populated areas. The moment stretched painfully long, every person in that command room holding their breath as we waited to see which direction this engagement would ultimately break. Then the Dominion vessel's course stabilized, moving decisively away from the colony rather than toward it, and I understood we had reached the turning point Bello had been waiting for. Their commander had made the decision every formal Dominion protocol eventually demanded when facing an engagement that had moved entirely outside predictable parameters: withdrawal. I allowed myself a slow, careful breath, aware that this moment, while enormously significant, still required careful handling. Bello immediately opened a direct channel toward the retreating fleet, and I listened closely as he addressed their commander personally, his voice calm and measured, despite everything that had unfolded over the past several hours. He did not gloat. He did not threaten further action. He simply stated, clearly and without embellishment, that Kest 9 remained under humanity's protection, and that any future attempt against this colony, or any other, would meet exactly the same resistance they had encountered today. The response that came back was brief, formal, and carried an unmistakable undertone of something I recognized immediately as reassessment. Their commander acknowledged the engagement's conclusion, requested confirmation regarding the status of captured personnel, and closed the channel without further comment. I looked toward Bello, waiting for some sign of relief or triumph, but his expression remained focused, already turning toward the practical work still required to properly close out this engagement. He reminded me immediately that our priority now shifted toward confirming the safety of every person in the colony, coordinating medical support where needed, and beginning the careful process of documenting everything that had happened here for whatever review would inevitably follow. I made my way through the valley over the following hour, checking in with each team that had carried out the defense we spent 2 days preparing. Callum met me near the tunnel entrances, exhausted but steady, confirming that every collapse point had functioned exactly as designed, without a single structural failure. Naomi reported that her sensor deception systems had successfully redirected the majority of the fleet's initial advance, buying critical time that made every subsequent phase of the defense possible. Julian, still moving with the same quick energy he had shown from the very first conversation we shared, was already helping coordinate equipment recovery from the disabled landing craft scattered across the valley. Bridget and Owen returned from securing the final Dominion holdout position, reporting that all remaining enemy personnel had surrendered without further complication once their commander's withdrawal order reached them. I felt a deep, quiet relief hearing that news, grateful the engagement had concluded, without the kind of extended conflict that might have cost far more than it already had. I made my way back to the tunnels where Priya and the sheltering colonists waited, and the moment I stepped into that space and confirmed the fleet had withdrawn, I watched relief spread through the crowd in a wave of quiet, overwhelmed emotion. Parents embraced their children. Neighbors reached for each other's hands. Priya herself simply closed her eyes for a long moment, absorbing the reality that everything her community had built together over 2 exhausting days had actually worked. She approached me afterward, her earlier composure returning steadily as the shock of the morning began settling into something more manageable. She thanked me, thanked every member of our crew, and asked what would happen now that the immediate danger had passed. I told her honestly that the wider galaxy would need time to properly understand what had happened here today, that the Council who had dismissed our warning days earlier would face difficult questions about their initial refusal to act. I told her that Kest-9's name would likely become known far beyond this small valley, not as a colony that fell to an overwhelming force, but as the place where an entire fleet learned exactly how thoroughly they had misjudged what humanity was capable of, when everything that mattered was at stake. She considered that for a long moment, then asked one final question, quieter than the others, carrying a weight I understood completely. She asked whether this was truly over, or whether today's events meant colonies like Kest-9 would need to prepare for this kind of danger again in the future. I did not have a comfortable answer for her, and I chose not to offer a false one. I told her that today's outcome would likely change how the wider galaxy viewed humanity, and that change would carry consequences we could not yet fully predict. But I also told her that whatever came next, the resourcefulness and courage her community had shown over the past 2 days proved they were far more capable of facing that uncertain future than anyone, including themselves, might have believed possible before dawn arrived. She nodded slowly, something steady and resolved settling into her expression, and I recognized in that moment the same quiet strength I had witnessed throughout this entire engagement, present not just in trained soldiers and careful tactical planning, but in ordinary people who had simply refused to accept that their home was undefendable. The sun climbed higher over the valley as the last of the immediate crisis response wound down, casting warm, steady light across a colony that had, against every expectation the wider galaxy held about humanity's capabilities, successfully defended itself from a fleet that arrived at dawn, fully convinced this would be an easy, uncontested conquest. It had been anything but easy, and nothing about what happened here today would be quickly forgotten, not by the Dominion commander now retreating with a fleet far smaller and far less confident than the one he had arrived with, and not by anyone across the galaxy who would soon hear exactly what happened when humanity decided, quietly and without permission, to be ready. 3 days after the Dominion fleet withdrew from Kest-9, I stood again on the bridge of the Harbinger's wake, watching a very different kind of transmission scroll across the same display where this entire mission had begun. This one came from the Terran Defense Council, and unlike their earlier dismissal, this message carried none of the careful, doubtful language I remembered from our first attempt to warn them. News of what happened at Kest-9 had traveled quickly, not because we sought recognition, but because the wider Concord, the loose alliance of species who governed most diplomatic relations across this region of space, could not ignore an engagement where a single warship and an unarmed colony had successfully repelled a full Dominion fleet without significant loss of life on either side. Reports had reached Concord Command through channels far beyond our control, carried by Dominion survivors themselves, by neighboring systems who had tracked the unusual fleet movements, by the simple, undeniable fact that a colony marked for pacification remained standing. Bello read through the Council's message beside me, his expression unreadable as always, though I noticed a faint tightness around his eyes that told me this moment carried more weight for him than he was willing to show openly. The council acknowledged, formally and without the careful hedging that had defined our earlier conversation, that their initial assessment of the intercepted intelligence had been mistaken. They requested a full briefing on everything that had transpired, along with, notably, a formal review of protocols governing how future threat intelligence would be handled going forward. I felt a complicated mixture of vindication and quiet exhaustion reading those words. Vindication, because everything we had risked, everything the people of Kest-9 had trusted us with, had proven justified beyond any reasonable doubt. Exhaustion, because I understood how easily this outcome could have gone differently, how many small decisions across those 3 days had needed to align perfectly for this ending to be possible. Before responding to the council, Bello asked me to accompany him back down to the colony one final time before we departed. I agreed without hesitation, feeling I owed the people of Kest-9 a proper farewell after everything we had shared together over those difficult days. We found Priya overseeing the early stages of reconstruction near the damaged sections of the colony's outer perimeter, directing repair teams with the same steady competence she had shown throughout the entire crisis. She greeted us warmly, though I noticed new lines of exhaustion around her eyes that spoke to how little sleep she had managed since the engagement ended. She walked us through the valley, showing us the collapsed tunnel sections Callum's team was already carefully reinforcing, the recovered equipment Julian and his crew were sorting through for salvage, the quiet, steady rhythm of a community already working to rebuild what the past few days had cost them. I noticed something remarkable in the atmosphere around us, not the lingering fear I might have expected, but a kind of settled, hard-won confidence that had not existed in this valley before dawn on that difficult morning. Naomi approached us near the central dome, updating Bello on the final status of the sensor systems that had played such a critical role in the defense, information that would likely prove valuable for other colonies facing similar vulnerabilities in the future. I found myself grateful for her meticulous documentation throughout the crisis, knowing it would help ensure other communities never had to face a threat like this one, as unprepared as Kest-9 had been before our warning arrived. Callum joined us shortly after, his exhaustion clear but his satisfaction unmistakable, as he described plans already forming among the mining crews to better integrate defensive considerations into future tunnel work, a permanent lesson drawn from what this valley had endured. I listened to him speak with a quiet pride I had not expected to feel so strongly, understanding that whatever came next for Kest-9, this community would never again face a threat as unprepared as they had been only days earlier. Before we departed, Priya gathered the colonists one final time in the same dome where Bello had addressed them the night before the fleet arrived. This time, the atmosphere carried none of the tension from that earlier gathering. Instead, I felt something closer to quiet gratitude and hard-earned resilience as she spoke, thanking every person for their contribution, acknowledging specifically the courage it had taken to trust an unexpected warning and act decisively, despite understandable fear. She then turned to Bello and me, thanking us both personally, and asked if there was anything we wished to share with her community before we returned to the wider fleet. Bello spoke briefly, telling the gathered colonists that what happened here would not be forgotten, that their courage and resourcefulness had changed how the wider galaxy understood humanity's capabilities, and that the lessons learned at Kest-9 would help protect countless other communities who might otherwise have faced similar danger unprepared. I found myself unexpectedly moved when he gestured for me to speak as well. I looked out across the faces gathered in that dome, remembering the fear and uncertainty I had carried during our approach to this system days earlier, remembering how thoroughly that fear had transformed into something closer to fierce, protective pride as I watched this community rise to meet an impossible challenge. I told them simply that I had come to Kest-9 expecting to help defend a vulnerable colony, and instead had witnessed an entire community prove they were never truly vulnerable at all, only unprepared for a threat they had never needed to consider before. I told them that preparation, resourcefulness, and the willingness to trust each other completely under enormous pressure had carried this valley through a crisis that should have overwhelmed it, and that this lesson would stay with me for the rest of my career. The gathering ended with quiet, steady applause rather than celebration, appropriate for a community still processing everything they had survived together. As we made our way back toward our shuttle, Priya walked beside me one final time and asked quietly what I believed would happen next, both for her colony and for humanity's broader relationship with the wider galaxy. I told her honestly that I believed the coming months would bring significant change, both in how seriously threat intelligence involving human territory would be treated going forward, and in how other species across the Concord understood exactly what they were dealing with when they encountered humanity's particular blend of adaptability, resourcefulness, and unwavering resolve. She smiled slightly at that, then offered a final thought that stayed with me throughout our journey back to rejoin the wider fleet. She said that whatever reputation humanity earned from what happened here, she hoped it would be remembered not simply as a story of victory, but as proof of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to accept that their home was indefensible, and chose instead to prepare, adapt, and stand together against odds that should have overwhelmed them entirely. I carried that thought with me as our shuttle lifted away from Kest 9, watching the valley shrink beneath us until it disappeared entirely into the wider darkness of space. Bello sat quietly beside me during the ascent, and once we reached orbit, he turned to me with a question that echoed the same one Priya had asked days earlier. He asked whether I believed this was truly finished, or simply the beginning of something far larger. I considered the question carefully before answering, thinking back over everything that had unfolded since that first intercepted transmission arrived without warning, transforming an ordinary patrol into a mission that would ultimately reshape how an entire species understood humanity's place among the stars. I told him I believed we had just sent a message far beyond anything contained in our final transmission to the retreating Dominion fleet, a message to every species watching, listening, and reassessing what they thought they understood about the quiet, unassuming newcomers who had entered galactic society only a short time earlier. The message was simple, even if the events that delivered it had been anything but. Humanity would not be caught unprepared again. We would listen carefully, act decisively, and protect what mattered using every resource, every skill, and every ounce of stubborn determination our long, difficult history had taught us to rely on. As our ship prepared for the jump back toward the heart of Concord space, I looked one final time toward the direction of Kest 9, now far behind us, and felt a quiet, steady certainty settle over everything that had happened. They had assaulted at dawn, fully confident in an easy victory that history and doctrine assured them was guaranteed. They had found instead a galaxy's newest nightmare, patient, prepared, and utterly unwilling to be underestimated ever again.